Elon Musk has never been a man of small ambitions. He wants cars that drive themselves. He wants his own artificial intelligence built from the ground up. He wants to slip tiny chips inside human brains and rewire what it means to be alive. But somewhere above all of that, sitting at the very top of his impossible list, is a dream that feels almost too big to say out loud. He wants humanity to live on more than one planet. He wants us to stop being prisoners of a single sky. And the machine he built to carry that dream is called Starship. It's the most powerful rocket ever assembled by human hands, taller than most skyscrapers, heavier than anything that has ever clawed its way off the surface of the Earth. When it stands fully stacked at the South Texas launch site, it doesn't look like a vehicle. It looks like a cathedral made of steel pointed at the stars. But right now, that cathedral is grounded. Not by gravity, not by engineering, not by money. By paperwork. The story really begins in April of 2023. After years of welding, testing, exploding, rebuilding, and welding again, Starship finally rose off its launch pad. For a few minutes, the world held its breath. Cameras clicked. Engineers cried. The ground shook so hard it sent chunks of concrete flying across the Texas dirt like shrapnel. For a few minutes, it looked like history was being made. And then it wasn't. The pad beneath the rocket had been torn apart by the sheer fury of the engines. There were craters where there had once been concrete. Debris was scattered across the surrounding land like a war zone. The rocket itself climbed for a while, tumbled, lost control, and finally tore itself open in the sky in a flash of orange fire. The launch was over, the damage was just beginning. The environment around the launch site took a beating no one had quite prepared for. Dust clouds drifted over nearby wildlife habitats. Pieces of metal landed in places they were never supposed to land. And quietly in offices in Washington and Texas, the phones started ringing. What followed wasn't another launch attempt. It was a long, slow, painful line of regulators, environmental officers, lawyers, and government letters. In the middle of September, a man named Kelvin Coleman sat down for an interview. He runs the Commercial Space Transportation Office at the Federal Aviation Administration. He's the kind of person whose name most people will never know, but whose signature can decide whether a billion-dollar rocket flies or stays bolted to the ground. He sounded calm, almost optimistic. He said his office was working closely with SpaceX. They were going through every single box that needed to be ticked after the April mishap. The investigation, he said, had officially been closed on September the 8th. But closing the investigation wasn't the same as clearing the rocket to fly again, not even close. There were 63 corrective actions the company had been ordered to complete, 63 separate fixes. Some were small, some were enormous, and 27 of them were tied directly to public safety. Those were the ones that mattered most. Those were the ones that couldn't be skipped, couldn't be rushed, couldn't be negotiated. Before Starship could lift off again, SpaceX had to prove on paper with evidence, with documentation, that every one of those safety items had been handled. Not just claimed, proven. And then there was the license itself. The permission slip the FAA had given SpaceX back in April only covered that one single launch on April the 20th. It was a one-time pass. For another flight, the entire license had to be modified. New paperwork, new review, new signatures. Coleman said the schedule looked good. Maybe mid to late October, he thought. The acting head of the FAA, Polly Trottenberg, had said something almost identical at a conference just a few days earlier. For a brief, hopeful moment, it almost felt like Starship would fly again before the year ended. Then came the second wall, and it was taller than the first. There was another review happening at the same time. A quieter one, an environmental one. Because after the April launch carved up the pad like a knife through soft butter, SpaceX had built something new underneath the rocket, a water deluge system. A massive plumbing setup designed to shoot enormous walls of water upward the moment the engines ignite. The idea was simple: soak up the heat, soften the shockwave, stop the pad from getting shredded a second time. It sounds harmless when you describe it out loud. Spray water at a rocket, how could that possibly hurt anyone? But the law doesn't see it that way. That water, once it touches the rocket, the pad, the chemicals, the residue, the burned metal, that water becomes industrial wastewater. And the Clean Water Act has very firm, very old, very strict opinions about industrial wastewater. So does the Endangered Species Act, because the launch site doesn't sit in the middle of nowhere. It sits right next to delicate coastal habitats, salt flats, and protected wildlife corridors. Birds nest there, turtles cross there. Creatures that have no idea what a rocket is depend on that land staying clean and quiet. So the FAA reached out to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They asked the agency to take a careful look at what SpaceX had built and to decide whether the new deluge system might harm the land or the animals living on it. The consultation officially started around the 11th of August. And here's where the story took a turn that genuinely upset the man at the top. A spokesperson from Fish and Wildlife spoke to Bloomberg. Her name was Aubrey Bozick, a public affairs officer with a calm, careful tone. She explained the process in plain English. Once the FAA's final biological assessment lands on the desk of Fish and Wildlife, and once that assessment is judged to be complete, the clock starts ticking. From that moment, the agency has up to 135 days to issue its final biological opinion. 135 days. And if they need additional information at any point, that window can stretch even further by mutual agreement. The math was brutal. If Fish and Wildlife used the full 135 days, Starship would not fly in 2023, not in October, not in November, not in December. The dream of an interplanetary species would have to wait until the next calendar year. But it got worse. Because as of mid-September, the agency hadn't even begun the review yet. The file was sitting somewhere, untouched, unopened. The clock that everyone was so worried about hadn't even started counting. Musk, who has never been a man to keep his frustrations quiet, posted about it on X. He called it unacceptable. He called it absurd. He said it was somehow easier to build a giant rocket from raw steel than it was to shuffle the paperwork required to launch it. You could almost feel the exhaustion behind the words, the disbelief, the way a builder feels when he finishes a house only to discover the inspector hasn't even left his office yet. SpaceX had already done the work. The corrective actions were largely complete. The new deluge system was already installed at the Starbase launch mount, gleaming and untested but ready. The hardware was waiting. The rocket was waiting. The engineers were waiting. And the people who needed to sign off on it hadn't even opened the folder. Meanwhile, the FAA was careful with its public words. Every statement was measured. Every sentence sounded like it had been written by a committee of lawyers. The agency said it was committed to making sure every safety concern, every environmental concern, and every regulatory question was answered before Starship was cleared to fly again. If the agency decided that the older 2022 environmental assessment was no longer valid, because too much had changed at the launch site, then a much bigger, much more thorough review might be needed. That would mean months more, possibly many more. It was the kind of statement that says nothing and everything at the same time. Inside SpaceX, the work didn't stop. It never does. The team destacked Ship 24 from the top of Booster 9, carefully separating the two halves of the giant. According to Kathy Luters, the former NASA executive who had recently joined the company, this was the final preparatory step before launch. The flight termination system was being reconfigured. That's the safety mechanism that destroys the rocket if something goes catastrophically wrong. In April, it had taken too long to trigger. This time, it had to be perfect. Engineers were walking through ticket after ticket, problem after problem. Each one responsible for their own corner of the machine, each one inspecting, double-checking, rechecking as if the launch were tomorrow morning. They were exploring every possible measure to push the odds of success higher. Every weld, every wire, every line of code, anything that could improve the chances of the vehicle and the mission surviving the next attempt. They were still hopping, still preparing as if the green light might come at any moment. But the truth, as the year wound down toward its final months, was harder than the hope. A rocket built to take humans to Mars, the most powerful machine ever assembled by human hands, was sitting in South Texas. Fully built, fully fueled by ambition, watched over by some of the most brilliant engineers alive. And it was waiting. Not for weather, not for fuel, not for a green light from physics. It was waiting for a government office to open a file. Somewhere in that strange, frustrating gap between what humans can build and what humans can approve, the dream of becoming an interplanetary species was learning something it had never been good at. Patience.